and welcome to the second night of this summer's Straight Talk series, Our Fragile Democracy. Thank you to the Furman Police, the McAllister Auditorium staff, and everyone else who made sure we didn't have long lines tonight. And it'll be just as good next week. I'm sorry we had those lines last week, but I'm also glad that so many people want to be here for this important presentation. Before I get started, we have a little bit of housekeeping. Someone with the last name Lattimore has a lost and found item in the lobby. So if that might be you and you're missing something, see one of the ushers in the lobby. You can do it now or after the program, and they will reunite you with your lost item. As he said, I am the director of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, or OLLI, here at Furman. We partner each year with the Riley Institute to present the Straight Talk series. Offering programs like this one fit with our mission of providing a diverse learning community of senior adults engaged in non-credit educational courses and programs, social opportunities, and physical activities that inspire our members to stay mentally and physically active in a supportive, nurturing, and fulfilling university environment. In addition to attending the Straight Talk series, OLLI members examine current issues with a variety of courses, such as our Great Decisions program. We have a course called Last Week's News. We have a course this semester called Religion in the Media, and many others that encourage robust, respectful discussions. We are also pleased to offer intergenerational programming and other opportunities to bring Furman students and our senior adult OLLI members together to share perspectives and learn from each other. I'm especially glad tonight to welcome students, faculty, staff, OLLI members, and everyone else from the Greenville area to learn about and discuss these important issues facing our community, our state, and our nation. Tonight's topic is Free and Fair Elections, Protecting Democracy in America. Dr. Daniel Vinson, Professor of Politics and International Affairs here at Furman, is tonight's moderator, and I'd like to welcome her to the stage. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you, Nancy. I'm excited to hear this evening from our speakers as we look at free and fair elections in America. If you were with us last week, you heard from two well-informed individuals about what our country faced in 2020 and 2021 and continues to face as we enter the 2024 presidential election year. You may recall that former Director of National Intelligence Mike McConnell noted that the writers of the Constitution, who understood that demagogues destroy democracies, established a system of checks and balances that has prevailed. We also heard from Timidayo Igenga-Williams about where the facts of the investigation of the January 6 attack on the Capitol and the attempt to overturn the 2020 election led. If you were with us, you may recall Mr. Igenga-Williams' challenge to us to look at the facts with an open mind as, quote, a call to patriotism and love of country. Tonight, we shift our focus to the role of states in safeguarding the integrity and security of free and fair elections. We're going to hear how changes in the roles of election officials and election processes have either weakened or strengthened the security of elections and what that means for the 2024 election. One question to think about for yourself tonight is how confident you are in the legitimacy of the upcoming 2024 election and whether your confidence would wane if the, quote, wrong person is elected. To help us understand what is happening in states across the country, and specifically in our neighboring state of Georgia, a key swing state, we have two special guests with us this evening. Our first speaker tonight is Larry Norden. Mr. Norden is the Senior Director of the Elections and Government Program at the Brennan Center for Justice at the New York University School of Law. His work focuses on ensuring that U.S. election infrastructure is secure and accessible to every voter and protecting elections from disinformation and foreign interference. He's going to set the stage for us tonight by talking about how the challenges of 2020 and its aftermath will impact election administration in 2024, as well as some new challenges we may face in the upcoming election. After Larry speaks, we'll hear from Georgia's Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger. First elected in 2018 and overwhelmingly reelected in 2022, Secretary Raffensperger is a lifelong conservative Republican who was thrust into the national spotlight when he received a rather famous, or infamous, recorded phone call from then-President Donald Trump asking him to, quote, find 11,780 votes, and thereby overturn the results of the presidential election in Georgia. Secretary Raffensperger is here to talk about the importance of safeguarding the integrity of our elections, especially in the face of false claims of election fraud. Following the presentations, I look forward to talking on stage with Secretary Raffensperger and Mr. Norden and asking some follow-up questions. We'll also allow time at the end for your questions, so be prepared. Use the QR code on the screen or on the front of your program and submit your questions through them. Thank you to my colleague, Dr. Buket Ostas, who is again working with two Riley Institute Advanced Team students, Katie Beasley and Grayson Taylor, to sort and prioritize your questions. Please join me now in welcoming to the stage Mr. Larry Norden.
Thank you. Thanks to Furman University for inviting me here today. It's really an honor to be here and to be able to share the stage with Secretary Raffensperger. I also want to thank Jill Fusen for showing me around Greenville this afternoon. This is my first time in Greenville. It's a really beautiful city, and I'm sorry that I can't spend more time here, but I'll certainly be coming back. I was really impressed with my short tour this afternoon. So I'm going to be talking about the elections in 2024, but I'm going to start back in 2020 and tell you about a story about a friend of mine. Her name is Tina Barton, and up through 2020, she was an election official in Rochester Hills, Michigan. She happens to be a Republican. I will tell you about Tina. She's a patriot. She loves her country. She comes from a family of public service. You'll see over there, her husband is a sheriff's deputy. She has a couple of wonderful grandchildren, one of whom is in the picture. She and her family have been active for many years in her church and in her community in Rochester Hills. And she's a beloved figure in Rochester Hills. And if she was here, I'm sure that you would love her. She's really a generous, kind, gregarious person who, as I said, served her community for many, many years. I'm going to play a voicemail message for you that was left for her a few days after the election.
He will demand the truth, and you will pay for your lying remarks, you liberal lying rhino. We will take you out. Your family, your life, you watch your back.
So, I'm sorry to say that this was not an isolated incident. Tina had many messages left for her like this in the weeks following the election. Some of them weren't messages, some of them were actual live encounters. And so you might ask what specifically prompted this, why Tina? So I'll tell you a little bit about the story behind the fact that she got these floods of threats. So like many election officials and election workers in the weeks before November of 2020, Tina and her staff worked day and night to prepare for Election Day. On election night, after the polls had closed, there was an error. There was votes are uploaded from machines into a central tally server, and one set of votes was uploaded twice. Tina noticed this pretty quickly. A lot of people don't know this, but there are a lot of checks in the system to find mistakes like that when they happened. When she noticed it, she called the county. She told them to correct it. There was a small set of votes that were counted twice. The county fixed it, and on the unofficial tallies for the county, it was Oakland County in Michigan, the correct numbers were put up, and they were later confirmed with an audit and reconciliation that was done. So Tina and her staff really didn't think a lot about this in the days that followed. But 3 days later, the National Party chair of the RNC held a press conference down the road from where Tina worked and lived. And she falsely claimed, quote, "We found 2,000 ballots that were given to the Democrats that were Republican ballots in Rochester Hills." And I don't have the video here of that press conference, but if you were able to watch it here, you would hear people in the room gasp because a lot of the people in that room knew Tina. She was a long time an active member of the local Republican Party there. Tina considered many of those people in that room her friends. Within hours of that press conference, and Tina didn't know anything about this, nobody called her, asked her about what happened, the press secretary to the President of the United States tweeted this out. And I want to be clear, none of what's here is true. There were no questions to be answered. The people who were involved in the elections knew exactly what happened. As I said, there was an uploading error. They caught it, they knew it, they corrected it. No one explained at the press conference or in this tweet that the 2,000 votes, extra votes, the issue was corrected and that the tallies that for Oakland County were correct. So why does all of this matter? What's the relevance to the 2024 election? First of all, I just want to make clear, like millions of Americans were left with the impression after this that Tina was part of some big conspiracy. And Tina wasn't alone. There were many other election officials who were blamed for an election outcome that people didn't like. And the Brennan Center conducted a survey of election officials just in March of this year, so it's already 2 years after the election. A lot of election officials that worked in 2020, like Tina, left because of the threats that they received. Despite that fact, when we asked election officials, this is a survey of local election officials, so it's officials working at the county level, at the state level, at the county level, at the town level, when we asked them, have you been threatened or abused or harassed because of your job, almost 1 in 3 said that they had. And if you look at the numbers on the right, one of the things that's really striking to me is more than 1 in 4 election officials say they're concerned about being assaulted on the job. Majority of them report that they know people who have left because they've been threatened from the elections field, that they're worried about what this means for retention in the field, to be able to keep people, to be able to recruit people to work in elections. And the fact of the matter is that we're 2 years plus past the election. A lot of Americans still believe that the 2020 election was rigged. In fact, a CNN poll from this summer showed that 38% of Americans believe that the 2020 elections were not legitimate. And this false belief has reshaped election law in the past few years. It has reshaped the elections administration field, and we're about to relitigate these false claims all over again, both literally, potentially in the case of the trial of President Trump, and certainly on the campaign trail in 2024. And what I'm going to talk about today is how this makes us more vulnerable to attacks against our elections in 2024. I should say I'm not particularly interested in relitigating the 2020 election, but I do think it's important to level set because the lies about the 2020 election are so critical to understanding the threats in 2024. As probably many people in this room know, there were dozens of cases that were brought by President Trump and his allies to challenge the results of the election with a claim that there was widespread fraud in the election. These were brought mostly in the battleground states, and the plaintiffs in those cases, including President Trump's campaign, consistently lost. These were cases, in 38 cases, that were heard before Republican judges. In many of those cases, by judges who were appointed by President Trump himself. And in another context, in a less partisan context, in a context that had less salience for Americans, I don't have any doubt that Americans, for the most part, would say if somebody's lost in court over 60 times around some kind of theory, that theory is probably not accurate. But of course, that's not the situation we're dealing with. We're dealing with a presidential election that people are very, care a lot about, have been very focused on, and that people have continued to lie about since the 2020 election. And as I say, I think that presents a lot of challenges us for 2024. Since 2020, 27 states have passed 60 new voting laws that the Brennan Center, where I work, has labeled restrictive voting laws, restricting the right to vote. We've been keeping track of the change in election law for over a decade, and this was the most that we saw in that 21-22 period in the entire time that we've been tracking changes in election law. The key thing is that most of these new restrictions mirrored the exact claims that were dismissed in court. Most of these changes, the justification given mirrored those claims. And in the 12 battleground states where there were new restrictive laws passed, 11 of them were justified on the very claims that were dismissed by the courts. So to give you one example, I'll talk about Texas SB 1, which was a law that dramatically overhauled the laws in the state of Texas. A lot of focus on mail ballots, again, because this was, I think, a point of contention after the 2020 election. Among other things, it requires clerks in Texas to reject mail ballots and mail ballot applications if voters did not include a driver's license or social security number that exactly matches what's on the voter file. You might say, what's the problem with that? Somebody has to provide that information. It has to be checked. The problem is that a lot of people aren't going to remember if they provided their driver's license number or their social security number when they register to vote. And in Texas, if you supplied your social security number when you registered and your driver's license number when you filled out your mail ballot gets rejected, and vice versa. In Texas, if you registered before there was any requirement to provide that information, your ballot was going to get rejected because there was going to be no ability to match. So in the primary last year, 18,000 ballots were rejected for this reason because there was not an exact match. That provision, I should say the Brennan Center, other organizations have challenged that law, and that provision was recently enjoined by a federal court, but not before lots of voters were disenfranchised, and of course, that was just a preliminary injunction, so we're not at the end of the stages of the legal appeals for that case. I think even more importantly than the new restrictions that we've seen that pass that are related to these unfounded claims of fraud are laws that have targeted election officials like Tina Barton. They also sprung from a lot of the false claims around what happened in 2020. Since 2020, states have passed 12 new laws that have been enacted to impose civil or criminal penalties on election officials for really technical reasons. So again, pointing to Texas SB 1, which I just mentioned earlier, the new law there in Texas says that if an election official encourages a voter who is entitled to vote by mail, encourages them to vote by mail, that election official will face prison time and tens of thousands of dollars in fines. One election official said, this new law is preventing me from basically doing my job. Other laws seek to punish election officials who told the truth about the 2020 election. And I want to stipulate here, and I hope that he doesn't mind, but Secretary Raffensperger, who you're about to hear from, was really a hero in the weeks after the 2020 election. He was under tremendous pressure to lie about the election results. His family was threatened, and he consistently told the truth and supported the rule of law in the state of Georgia. In 2021, the Georgia legislature removed his office from the State Board of Elections and said that they were going to select that position on the State Board of Elections. And his is not an exceptional case. I can point to a number of other changes in the law where the responsibilities of election offices were changed and declined because of what happened in the 2020 election, I'll say. Since 2020, around the country, there have been investigations and prosecutions of election officials that were ultimately thrown out for lack of evidence, but that didn't stop law enforcement prosecutors from really turning over the lives of election officials who had to figure out a way to defend themselves and to pay for that defense. The result has been a massive turnover among election officials. 1 in 5, according to the Brennan Center survey, will be new in 2024. And in battleground states like Arizona, that number's far higher. So in Arizona, there's 17 counties. In 15 counties, they're going to have new election officials as top officials. And really, it's no mystery why this has been happening. Leslie Hoffman, who is in Yavapai County, Arizona, is an example of this. She resigned due to relentless harassment, including her dogs being poisoned. When she left, she said she just couldn't take the daily nastiness and abuse anymore. So, as I said, this heightens risks for 2024. Why? Well, first of all, there's been this massive turnover of election officials. There are necessarily probably going to be more errors like what happened in Rochester Hills. New people who haven't run a high-pressured presidential election before. Maybe they won't be as fast as Tina. They'll find them eventually, but maybe they won't be as fast to correct them. And that will certainly be used to undermine confidence in the elections. Second, we have people, a small number, but it certainly exists, who have replaced these election officials who are conspiracy theorists themselves, who have a lax commitment to the law, is how I'll put it. Several officials in the past couple of years have allowed their voting systems to be breached by conspiracy theorists in violation of the law. We've had election officials who have refused to certify elections because they didn't like the election results. Now, the courts ultimately forced them to certify the elections, but there's no question in my mind that it's very damaging to public trust in our system when this happens, and frankly, it's a danger to other election officials when the message to the public is an election official is a player on a team and not an umpire who doesn't get to decide who wins or loses. And I think new dangers in 2024 make this a potentially more difficult problem than we saw in 2022. One reason is foreign interference in our elections. Presidential years are when we have a history of foreign governments trying to interfere in our election, in particular Russia, China, and Iran. And this is just one example. After the 2020 election, this website, Enemies of the People, was created by the Iranian government. It was really meant to incite violence against election officials and other government officials over anger in the 2020 election. Another is that we have new AI tools that can fabricate voice recordings, that can generate lifelike images. And I'm going to show you one example that set Twitter abuzz just a few months ago. This was created by the Dutch deepfake YouTube channel DeepNep, and I will say this looks like Morgan Freeman, but he had absolutely nothing to do with the creation of.
I am not Morgan Freeman, and what you see is not real. Well, at least in contemporary terms, it is not. What if I were to tell you that I am not even a human being? Would you believe me?
So I don't think it takes too much imagination to think about how this could be used in an election context in 2024. We already have seen many election workers, election officials defamed. You can imagine somebody creating videos of election workers saying things that they didn't say, and that's spreading over the internet. So all of this makes for a potentially explosive situation in 2024, but I just want to talk about some reasons I actually have hope for free and fair elections in 2024. And a big reason is we're more prepared than we were in 2020. Law enforcement and election officials are cooperating in ways that they didn't ahead of 2020. This is a screenshot of the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections. I'm a member, but mostly it's made up of law enforcement and election officials who are meeting around the country to strategize about how to ensure that election workers and voters can participate without intimidation in the process. We have Democratic and Republican states across the country that have passed new laws to protect election workers. And I think very importantly, we've had people who threatened election officials being brought to justice. So that voicemail message that you heard, that guy was just indicted just a couple of weeks ago for threatening Tina Barton. I wish Tina were here to hear that. It took far too long, but I really am hopeful that this will act as a deterrent to other people leaving those kinds of messages and making those kinds of threats. The other thing is that we should have the ability to get ahead of some of the lies in 2024 in a way that we didn't in 2020. We know, we've studied, there's a consistency to the kinds of tropes and lies that we hear about elections, that there are rigged voting machines, that mail ballots coming from China have overwhelmed the system, and election officials have been doing a better and better job of getting out there on social media and explaining the security measures that they have in place. So this is from Secretary LaRose in Ohio, talking about the security measures for mail ballots. So there are a lot of examples of this, and there's I hope, going to be more going into 2024 from state, local election officials. So I want to wrap up here. I finally want to talk about the thing that gives me the most hope is that Americans recognize how critical this issue is and that our democracy is at risk. And this was a really stunning poll to me from Quinnipiac in June of 2023. Protection of our democracy was ranked as the #2 important issue for Americans just after the economy. And I think that this concern over our democracy, over ensuring nonpartisan election administration, showed up in the 2022 election results. We had candidates in 7 battleground states who were running to control elections on a platform saying they would not have certified the 2020 election results. All of them lost. All of them lost, and most did worse than all other candidates that were running for statewide office. And the good news is they mostly conceded after they lost, and so did the people who were supporting them. And that is my biggest reason for hope, is that maybe people have started to understand that this is a losing political strategy. I do think that it's the next few years that will determine for us how corrosive election denialism and the argument that election officials should be anything more than people who act as umpires and follow the rules has become, how damaging it has become. Will the public soundly reject that? Will public servants like Tina Barton, like Brad Raffensperger, stay committed to working in election administration? Will legislators around the country decide it's in their interest to move past false claims of widespread fraud? And certainly for the future of our democracy, I hope so. And I'll just close by saying that I believe it's incumbent on all of us to do our part to push back against election lies that divide and hurt us, and to stand up for people like Tina Barton, to stand up for people like Brad Raffensperger, who chose our democracy, who chose the truth and the rule of law over any particular party and candidate. And as hard as it might be for some of us to stand up and do that, it was certainly more difficult for them, and I think we owe it to them, and we owe it, frankly, to ourselves and our country. Thank you.
Okay. I'm Brad Raffensperger, and I'm Secretary of State from the state of Georgia. Since day one, my number one priority has been election security. I ran years ago, and I ran for city council because I could do that and still own a business and do that part-time. I ended up in the State House, did 2 terms there, 4 years, and I could still do that. My middle son was starting to handle more of the business. And then back in 2017, I thought, I'm going to run for Secretary of State, state of Georgia. And I wanted to run for that because in Georgia, the Secretary of State handles corporations. As a business owner, I had a corporation. I'd like to have that operation run smooth. And in fact, when I was in the General Assembly, I passed a law that lets you renew your corporation for up to 3 years, 1, 2, or 3 years. So I was looking at how can we remove obstacles for business owners. I'm a licensed structural engineer, licensed professional engineer, licensed general contractor. What can we do for people that have professional licenses? I thought that was a good thing. And then also something that caught my attention is that we had these old electronic machines. We had put them into service around 2002, 2004, after Bush v. Gore. Electronic voting without a paper ballot. And the machines had aged out. And it said, we need to have a new system with a verifiable paper ballot. And that's what I ran on. And we did end up winning. I was actually in a runoff. I was in a runoff, for the Republican nomination, and then as a runoff, in the fall. Which should probably tell people it wasn't that I was a bad candidate, it shows you how competitive Georgia had become. We really were becoming a 51-49 type of state. So the first thing that we did is we worked on getting a new verifiable paper ballot. We ran that through the General Assembly. But we also made sure that we secured some other things. One of the things that had happened is that when I won our race and Governor Kemp had won his race, the person that ran against him, Stacey Abrams, did not concede. She lost by 55,000 votes. So when I go on and I talk to on CNN or MSNBC, they don't want to talk about 2018, they want to talk about 2020. But this is called Straight Talk, so let's keep it real. She lost in 2018, and she lost even by more votes in 2022. Now, I will concede that what happened after 2020 was ramped up to a whole different level when it's the office of the President of the United States of America. But in Georgia, what we did in 2019 is we secured legislation and the funding to get new machines with a verifiable paper ballot. We also got the ability to join ERIC, the Electronic Registration Information Center. This is in the weeds, but many people always say that your voter lists aren't as clean as they should be. Well, most of that is due to federal law. But we had been sued because they were saying that subjectively we were taking people off the voter rolls. ERIC allows you to take people off the voter rolls objectively. I'm an engineer and I like objectivity. The reason what ERIC does is if, like South Carolina is a member of ERIC. And if someone from Georgia moves to South Carolina and registers here, your election office will tell us that someone has registered here from Georgia. And then we can contact that voter and we can take them off the voter rolls objectively. After the election of 2018, we had about 9 or 10 lawsuits from Stacey Abrams and all these other allied groups. And so we were trying to take things off the table through objective measures, verifiable paper ballot. We got that implemented in about end of January of 2020. And then what happened? Our world turned upside down. How do you run an election in the middle of a pandemic? We did it without changing any state laws. We understood that people were going to want to vote absentee. And so we then had the race of 2020. From our standpoint, from the standpoint of election management, November 2020 race was run well because we got the results up very, very quickly. The thing that really happened, and the thing that people still don't understand a lot, is how in the state of Georgia did President Trump end up losing. What people didn't understand, and they need to understand some data points. Number one, 28,000 people skipped the presidential race in the state of Georgia. They didn't vote for anyone. They did not vote for anyone, and yet they voted down ballot for different races. Our Republican congressmen collectively got 33,000 more votes than President Trump. Virtually every Republican state rep and state senator got about 5 or 6% higher vote totals than President Trump. And that's why President Trump came up short. Now, after the election, all of a sudden we started hearing these allegations. Number one is we heard that there was thousands of dead people that voted. We worked hard on that. We actually had been sued by the Trump campaign about 10,000. I had a phone call with President Trump, and in that phone call he said 5,000. Well, we had been sued by 10,000. At that time, when I had that phone call, we had found 2 dead people. Since in the last 2.5 years, we found 2 more, a total of 4 people, and that was it. They said that there were 66,000 underage voters. There was 0. But in Georgia, you can register to vote when you're 17 and a half. You have to be 18 by election day. We had their day, month, year. We verified every one of those 66,000 voters that were students. Every one of them had turned 18 by election day. 0. They said that there was over 2,076 felons that had voted. We verified all of the felony records, see who was still under felony sentence, and it was less than 100. Then they said that there was also 2,400 non-registered voters. There was 0. Every single allegation, none of it ever added up. But then they said, what about State Farm Arena? And when I say State Farm Arena and the counting of the absentee ballots, who here does not know what I'm talking about? There's just 1 or 2. Well, I'll tell you, did I tell you I was in the construction business? And when Fox News played the narration that Rudy Giuliani did to that state Senate meeting at the 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, and 10 o'clock, my phone was ringing off the hook from all my contractor friends saying, what in the heck happened there? We immediately went ahead and we did a deep dive because it was under 24/7 video surveillance. We called in our investigators. We called in the GBI to also look at it, and we found nothing. But here's what happened that night. Is if you look in the video, the full video, you'll see that these black storage boxes, they were called suitcases. They're absentee ballot, official absentee ballot storage boxes. They show in the morning, before they're wheeled in, that they're empty. They close it, zip tie it, and they wheel them in. What is the purpose of that? Is if you do not finish counting all those absentee ballots that night, you have a place to store them securely. They thought they were going to call a timeout and be done at 10:30 that night on election night. And the reason they said that is we've got thousands and thousands of these. We could stay for the next 72 hours and we still wouldn't be done. We just might as well go home and come back in the morning. Well, their election director for Fulton County said, no, you got to go back. But meanwhile, what they had started to do was pull out these empty storage boxes, put in these unscanned ballots, put them in there secure, and then wheel them underneath the table. When they get the call later, about 20 minutes later, no, you got to go back and work. They pull them out and put them back on the table and continue to count. Now, what did happen is the Republican, Independent, and the Democrat Party, observers did leave. And for about 50 minutes, our investigator and a person we had there as part of a consent agreement we had with Fulton County weren't there, and they got back there and stayed there till about 2 or 3 o'clock. So it was really that 50-minute period that we watched with our post-certified investigators and the GBI. And the FBI also looked at it, and when I talked to a Tea Party group, guess what they said to me? Well, you can't trust the FBI. And everyone chuckled, just like you just did there. But if you don't believe our investigators, you don't believe the GBI and you don't believe the FBI. If President Trump handpicked someone to look at it, would you believe that person then? Because President Trump did pick someone. Because many people don't realize that the U.S. Attorney of the Northern District resigned. And when he resigned, President handpicked Bobby Christine, the U.S. Attorney of the Southern District from Savannah, to come up to Atlanta to look at it. And I put his quote in my book. They were so rich because he was quoted in the AJC. Because he heard all this going on, he thought there had to be something there. He looked into it, and there was nothing there. About 4 to 6 weeks ago, 2 years, 2.5 years after this all went through, the state election board, which I don't chair anymore, thank you, Larry, yes, I don't chair that anymore, but that was part of the retribution. But the state election board said nothing happened there. But meanwhile, that urban legend is still out there. I say all that because that's what happened in the 2020 race. And so what I had to do then is really get our message out to people. Because I decided that I was going to run for re-election, and so did my governor. And the reason I decided is that you're not going to push me off the dime because of a lie. I'm going to stand for the truth. And I've been standing for the truth, and I've been standing for the Constitution since day one. So I've actually had a tremendous time. So I've talked to Tea Party groups, Republican Party group meetings. Democrats haven't invited me in. I don't know why. Their guy won, but whatever. But still, what I've talked to a lot of times are civic groups. I've talked to a lot of Rotarians, Kiwanis, the business exchange groups. And I love them all. But I really love that Rotary four-way test. Because just think about if Congress up in D.C., Richmond, north of Richmond, imagine about that if they read that. Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? The four-way test, because that's really where the rubber meets the road. We call them small-town values, but I think they are essential and eternal American values. Because I believe, my dad was a World War II veteran, I believe that it didn't matter if you were from western Pennsylvania like he was, didn't matter if you're from the hill country of West Virginia, if you could have been from Brooklyn or Bronx, New York, could have been from the farming fields of South Carolina or Georgia. I think the values were the same, that people are good and honest. And they still are today. And I think it's really important that then you go out and talk to people. And so what I did is I talked to them about what happened in 2020. I talked about Stacey Abrams. When we ran for re-election in 2022, we won finally after 4.5 years on every single count of Stacey Abrams' lawsuits from her Fair Fight, Fair Count organizations. And she never appealed. It took 4 years to finally win that. There was no voter suppression in 2018. She didn't like some of the rules, and she's trying to find excuses. I just think that when you lose a race, or when you lose a football game, just admit you lost, and then really, I know the coach is going to be working Clemson really hard this week, and so I wouldn't want to play against Clemson this weekend. I don't know about you, but they'll be fired up, I'm sure. They better be, or else the coach is going to work them twice as hard the next week. The point is, I think when you lead your life with honor, and you lead with that American spirit, you accept your losses, and you move on, learn something from it. Now, I do want to also talk about the Election Integrity Act that we put into place in 2021. Everyone has their favorite things when we pass these bills. Number one, I love that we don't use signature match anymore for our absentee ballot situation. Do you know why I love that we don't? Because people said it is subjective. And I said, I agree with you, because when I ran in 2018, I said this is subjective. We need to have an objective way. Did you know that we've been sued by a political party on that? Guess which one it was? It was both of them. We had been sued by the Democrats after 2018 when they lost, and then we were sued by the Republican Party, almost word for word. They just changed the name of the party after 2020. So we took it off the table, and we modeled it after, guess what state? Minnesota, which happens to be a left-leaning state. Because we said this is objective. You use photo ID based on your driver's license, a unique identifier, your driver's license number. They do the same thing in Nebraska and Kansas, which are on the right side of the aisle. It's just objective. I also just do, to keep it real, since we're doing straight talk, Minnesota's never been sued by the Department of Justice over that. Georgia has. So I just want to let you know that sometimes things don't go your way when you do the right thing. We also now have 17 days of early voting. We added a second Saturday. President Biden's home state of Delaware, has 11. We have 17 days. Now, I don't know how many you have in South Carolina, but I know you have something. And we think 17 is a good number. I will say this. I love having 2 Saturdays. Because guess who votes on a Saturday? People that have jobs that couldn't get off Monday to Friday. But this last session, guess what we did in Georgia? We said you got to give people time off for early voting so they have that opportunity, so you have additional opportunities to vote. In Georgia now, we found that 65% of all people are voting early, 35% are voting on 30% are voting on election day, and about 5 to 7% are voting absentee. It's no excuse absentee voting. And that's what people, that's their preference. They can vote any way they want. So we've made a lot of improvements in Georgia, and people need to have high confidence in that. And that's why I came here today. I just want to talk to you about that. I like to keep my part of this very, very short, because I really like to think that you'll probably learn a lot more when someone else out here asks a question, and then we can just kind of respond to it one after the other. I do know that I said this back in January of 2020 when we had our new machines in place. Maybe it's because I've worked out in the free market. I work with a lot of contractors, a lot of people that have been frustrated for a long period of time. But I think it's in several different segments. I think it's this group of folks, this group of people, both sides of the aisle feel disconnected. I understood how polarized we are in America. And that's why when a guy like Oliver Anthony writes a song, sings a song, Rich Man North of Richmond, it resonates with people. It's kind of like Woody Guthrie from the 30s, or probably maybe Dylan from the 60s. When they write these kind of songs, they somehow reach people. But one thing I do know, I have high confidence in the American people, because it was a George and Luke Bryant that also sang a song. And the words are, most people are good. And I believe that most people are good. And it's all going to work out. Lean into the good and look for people that have character, integrity, will do the hard thing. No matter how hard it is, they'll walk the line of integrity. We do that. That's how we get our country back. That's how we move forward, unified together. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Raffensperger and Mr. Norden, for your presentations. Secretary Raffensperger, I will be thrown out of this university if I do not ask this question of you right now. So you're in your office one day, and your staff comes to you and says, the President would like a word with you. Tell us about that. How did you react to it? How does it affect your job?
Well, I was actually home with my wife, Tricia. It was on a Saturday afternoon. And I like to blame this all on Neil Cavuto of Fox News, because I went on Cavuto that morning, and I basically told him what had happened, that 28,000 people skipped the presidential race, and Senator David Perdue in Metro Atlanta actually got about 20,000 more votes. And I shared those data points, and I gathered that the president was watching that, and he was none too pleased by that. So Mark Meadows called my deputy, Secretary of State, and she called me and said, the president wants to talk to you. And I said, oh, I don't think that's a good idea. We're being sued by them right now, and I just don't want to. And so she relayed that message, and she called back. Said, no, you're going to have a call. I said, well, then I want to make sure our general counsel's on the call. And so we had a call with the president, and I just tried to, best I could, help him understand that we didn't have 5,000, but 2 dead people. No one was shredding ballots and tearing up things in Cobb County. We just tried to give them data points and information. And so that's why we had a conversation that day.
Okay. You talked about Stacey Abrams not conceding. You talked about the fact that Trump refused to concede and in fact went on to add false allegations against people in your office, election workers. How do those kinds of things affect how you prepare those election workers? Larry talked about the threats that some of them are facing. How are you preparing those folks in your state to carry out their jobs under this heightened scrutiny and even the threats that they face?
In a strange way, I am I'm not being naive about this. I think because Governor Kemp and I both ran for re-election, that we had to go out and face the beast. We had to go out and talk to people all over the state. And we both won really big in 2022. So I think that was very helpful. I think we kind of helped move more and more people through that process. Whereas in many of the other states, like in Arizona, the governor was term limited. He was not running again. In Michigan, you had a Democrat governor. And so the state Senate put out a beautiful 60-page report saying nothing happened, but it just didn't have the same ability to really break through the noise. So I say that is we have had some turnover, but we are also finding that we have new people that are coming in and really doing the job. So we're not having the shortages that we're seeing in some other states. So from that standpoint, I think we're really fortunate. And I think that's really, I guess, goes back to the point, is I think people have to have the courage to stand up and do their job and say and do the right thing. Make sure you're right on your facts, but also then go out and have the courage of your convictions to really explain to people what did happen.
Larry, I want to kind of add a little bit to this question for you. We have a display in the lobby tonight asking our audience about their confidence in the election, and depending on who actually wins that next election, how might statements of public officials or candidates affect confidence in elections and whether people view them as legitimate?
I think it's tremendously important. If you look at polls going back to 2000, whichever side lost in the presidential election, you ask voters of that party, they are much less confident of the election results than the side that won, surprisingly. The side that won has a lot of confidence that the election results were accurate. The side that lost, not so much. That changed a little bit in 2016, I think in part because even though he won, President Trump went on to say he actually got 3 million more votes. So, but even there, Republicans were more confident in the election results in 2016 than Democrats. The difference in 2020 was that we had the leader of one of the parties, the candidate who lost, said that the election was rigged and it couldn't be trusted. And then you had a whole ecosystem of people supporting him who said the same thing. And, you know, nobody wants to feel like they lost. But to have our leaders, to have the leaders and the people that you turn to confirm to you that there's a reason to be suspicious makes all the difference. And I am convinced that it's the reason that in 2020, for the first time, we saw so many threats against election workers and election officials, and why we still have so many people who now just doubt the integrity of our system.
I want to ask a couple of questions about how we secure election infrastructure and how we make elections accessible to voters. That's one of the things the Brennan Center focuses on. You've made some requests of states, including Georgia. What kinds of requests have you made? What's the reasoning for these measures? And then I'm going to ask Secretary Raffensperger more about what Georgia's done.
So I'm glad that you put those things together, security and access, because when I do a lot of work on election security, and often election security and access are somehow put as like you have to sacrifice one for the other. And in fact, the way I think of election security is if you have good election security, you should have good access. In other words, when you're thinking about election security, the question should be if there's a bad actor or a mistake, frankly, which is probably even more common, how do you make sure that people can still vote? How do you make sure that at the end of the day that the vote totals that you have are accurate? That's access, right? That's ensuring access for people and ensuring that their votes get counted. When we think about election security, a common refrain is prevent, detect, and recover. And so those are the things that we really focus on when we make suggestions for what jurisdictions can do to improve election security. So example of prevent, I talked about some of these election officials who have turned over their equipment illegally to people that shouldn't have had access to it. How do you prevent that? Well, one of the things that we sent around to states shortly after this pattern started breaking out was what we saw as best practices in the country for limiting access to machines. So only the people who needed to have access to do their jobs should be allowed to get in the room with a voting machine when it's not an election day, right? That you should have video cameras and key card access, and that you're watching it so you know if somebody enters, as unfortunately has happened with some of these systems. So that's prevent. Recover, resiliency is so critical in election security. What do you do if voting machines go down on election day or electronic poll books? Is there something in place, paper poll books, for instance, that poll workers can turn to so that there aren't lines for hours as they're figuring out what went down? And this is something that Michigan adopted right ahead of the 2022 election. And in fact, we had an incident in Michigan where all the poll books went down in Wayne County, but they had those paper poll books backed up so that they could process people to vote. And of course, having paper ballots, as Secretary Raffensperger mentioned, is so important. You can't hack paper, right? We're worried about cybersecurity. When you have that paper record, you can go back and turn to it. And in terms of detecting, we should be looking at that paper. We should be auditing that paper after the election. Are the results accurate? The way they did in Georgia after the 2020 election. And here I will give Georgia a compliment on its election security practices. One of the things that we and other security experts have been calling for is something called risk limiting audits. And those are, a lot of states, I should say 93% of the country now votes on paper, right? Which is an extraordinary thing. A few years ago, the majority of the country voted on the kind of machines that Secretary Raffensperger was talking about, where there was no paper record. And can you imagine, after the 2020 election, if there was no paper to turn back to and people were claiming all kinds of fraud, who would know whether or not they should be believed about rigged voting machines? But risk-limiting audits say we're going to use statistics to compare the enough paper ballots to the electronic tallies that we have to say we have high statistical confidence that there's no way anybody than the candidate that was declared the winner won. And Georgia and a few states have adopted that. I think more are starting to, but that's like a really critical security measure.
Secretary Raffensperger, I want to come back to the Georgia election law you were talking about. We heard, Stacey Abrams certainly was criticizing the laws in the wake of 2018. You mentioned the changed law after the 2020 election. The new law replaced signature matching with voter ID requirements. You talked a little bit about that. It expands early voting a little bit, and it increases voting stations, machines, and staff in an area that had long lines. All of those things would be seen as making it easier for voters to access elections. But the law also reduced the amount of time for requesting an absentee ballot and requires absentee ballots to be returned a little bit earlier. It requires absentee ballots to be mailed to voters later than in the past. It limits who can assist absentee voters with returning their ballots, and it doesn't allow a voter to cast a provisional ballot if the voter shows up at the wrong polling location before 5. Those, some people would claim, are restrictive to voters. You do not have to deal with all of these, by the way.
Well,
I want to know, but my
list.
question is, there's a question in this. I'm mostly giving it that for your benefit, because some of you have heard things about Georgia election law, but you didn't know what it exactly did, or you assumed things that it didn't do. How do you respond to those who say those provisions are making it harder for people, and how do you strike that balance between, on one hand, ensuring that we don't have fraud and that we can process elections efficiently, because we want to know the election results in a reasonable time, but on the other hand, ensuring that voters don't have to jump through too many hoops to be able to exercise their right?
Well, obviously, people love that we've expanded early voting to 17 days. We have photo ID, which gives people confidence in that. It's more secure, and the other benefit about that is because it's more secure, it's elevated voters' confidence. And so it's a freebie, I think. And when you do things like that, then also it's just another good thing that we have. Lines have to be shorter than 1 hour. Counties determine how many machines you have at each precinct, how many precincts you have. That's a county determination. But when you have long lines, the Secretary of State was always getting the grief about that. And so in SB 202, we put that in there, that lines had to be shorter than 1 hour. Then we worked with the counties to make sure that they saw how many machines they had, what their throughput would be to keep those lines. And on the last election we had in 2022, we had, after about 10 o'clock in the morning, an average wait time of about 3 minutes. Now, there were some 45 minutes and things like that, but lines have to be shorter than 1 hour. So we're working on the Chick-fil-A model, trying to make sure everyone has a really quick drive-through experience. And so we think that's really important. It's just another benefit of that. As it relates to the absentee ballot requiring them to be returned earlier, in the old law, you could actually mail something on a Friday, we would never get it. And they'd say, well, I got disenfranchised. So what we said is you have to mail it more than 10 days out so that you know that the mail would actually get it back. Now, you can also deliver it back to the county, but it was to ensure that your ballot would get back in time so you wouldn't be disenfranchised. Because we always got bad press and got beat up on the left side of the aisle about absentee ballots were being rejected. We also did not send them out more than 60 days before the election, because we found that when you sent them out or requested it 120 days out, people would sometimes put in multiple requests forgetting that they already had done it just because there's so much time. So we put it closer to the election. And then out of precinct voting, what happened is in Georgia you could vote out of precinct, and then all of a sudden some campaigns were starting to use that as their campaign strategy. Hey, I'm running statewide, I don't care, just go ahead and vote anywhere. Well, what was happening is you were swamping the votes, swamping certain precincts, voting out of precinct, ending up with those long lines. So up until 5 p.m. you have to vote in your precinct. Both in Arizona and Florida, you have to vote in precinct the whole day. In Georgia, up to 5 o'clock. Then from 5 to 7, you can vote out of precinct. And that helps just to manage that situation better. So we think it really improves the voter experience and also just keeps the counties know who's going to actually be showing up that day. So really, it's a lot of election management tools that we did just to really help the operation for the counties to improve the process.
I want to make sure we have time for your questions, so I'm going to invite our two Riley Institute students, Katie Beasley and Grayson Taylor, to come to the podium with audience questions.
Oh, okay, sure.
If Donald Trump...
Give us a moment to get the technical difficulties worked out.
They'll turn it on for us probably.
Okay.
If Donald Trump wins the primary nomination and is convicted on one or more felony counts, what would be the Republican Party's response and reaction?
Talk a little bit louder.
If Donald Trump wins the primary nomination and is convicted on one or more felony counts, what would be the Republican Party's response and reaction?
You're the Republican Party representative up here. We're going to let you start, Secretary.
I think the Republican Party's response would be that he would be the nominee for the party. And so that's where we are right now. And I think when you saw the first presidential debate, many of the candidates that were up there said that they would be supporting the nominee. And so that's where we are right now. As Secretary of State, I never endorsed people. I did not endorse President Trump when he ran in 2020, which got me in trouble with the campaign because as Secretary of State, as the chief election official, I don't believe I should be endorsing people. But in 2020, I did let people know I voted for President Trump. Just so you know, there's no hard feelings here. You just came up short. And so I wanted to make sure they understood that was the case. What I'll also tell people, say, well, what are you going to vote for? Who are you going to vote for in 2024? I think I've been pretty darn clear. I'm going to be looking for character and integrity, someone that follow the rule and follow the Constitution. And I hope I'm not disappointed. I hope I have a choice like that. Thank you.
Our next question is, what do you have to say about gerrymandering and other measures that are used to target certain voting communities? How does this play into the fight for fair elections?
All right, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think it's gerrymandering is a big problem in this country. Oh, can you hear me? Yeah, is that better? No?
I could hear you.
Yeah.
You're on. Just hold it really close to your mouth.
Okay, is that better?
That's better. There you
All
go.
right. I think gerrymandering is one of the issues that has gotten us to the place where we are right now in this country. There are a few issues that I think have left people feeling like they don't have a voice, and that representatives don't represent their constituents. In much of the country, there aren't competitive contests, particularly for Congress. And look, you could say the same thing about the presidential election. Georgia happens to be one of the states that gets to decide, and your vote matters. But in much of the country, when we vote for president, we're just looking to the 6 or 7 states that get to determine who's president. And when it comes to gerrymandering, I think very often you don't have you have candidates who are so sure that they're going to win in the general election that they're only pandering to the extremes of their own party to make sure that they win the primary. So there's no question in my mind that it's a huge problem, and I do think that, you know, in some states they've solved this problem with ballot referenda, but I would love to see a national solution to that problem.
Secretary Raffensperger.
Well, right now Georgia is actually has a court case that's going on, and so I won't comment any further. So it's an ongoing legal thing, and so I don't think it's something I should talk much further on that. What I do believe, though, I do think that people talk about having a nonpartisan, bipartisan, we love everyone, redistricting commission. And what that has been shown is that people still bring their biases to these commissions. And so you have the General Assembly that they do their job, and then sometimes there's lawsuits like in Alabama. That's been before the courts twice. It's just one of those kind of issues when things get so far out of hand, the courts will fix it or the people do, because you get voters mad enough and they start throwing people out. And usually they talk about throwing, you know, with colorful language, who they're going to be throwing out. And so I think at the end of the day, it will reset itself.
I just want to make one more quick point. You know, I showed the statistics showing that people rated democracy as the number 2 issue. I do think it is critical that people think democracy matters, right? To preserve a democracy matters, and that that the electorate can act as a check on excesses. That's the reason we have democracy, and so that our representatives are responsive to the public. Otherwise, why not have any other kind of system? And when we have districts that are so gerrymandered, it can leave people feeling hopeless about the system. So I hope Secretary Raffensperger is right, and that we find a way to correct for that problem.
Good. Next question.
What does democracy mean to you, and what can we do to protect the integrity of our democratic system?
Who wants to go first?
I think the most important thing is to be involved in the process. Obviously, get registered, then vote. I'd also highly encourage you to think about volunteering to be a poll worker. Because if you ever had any questions about what the process looks like, once you've been a poll worker, you're going to know that it is safe, secure, and America does a really good job. But also when you hear your neighbor at the grocery store, at the ball field, or someplace like that in your church group saying something, you can say, well, no, Bob, or hey, Mary, no, I actually do that. That's not how it works. This is how it works. So you become a subject matter expert. So I think that's really important. And then we all have a part to play. And I just think it gets down to, at the end of the day, character, integrity, those basic values, people that you want to spend time with. And those are the kind of people you should be electing, knowing that they're good, decent human beings that want to do the right thing. You may not agree with them all the time, but you know that they're pointing true north.
And I'll just say again, I think we're incredibly lucky, and I think for so long we just took for granted our democracy. We're incredibly lucky to live in a democracy. You look at things that are going on in China or Russia or Iran, where people really have no say about how their government is run, and how often society is abused and how often their leaders do things that are repulsive to most of the country. Because we have a democracy, we have a voice. And for me, that's the critical reason to keep our democracy. In terms of what people can do, I certainly agree with Secretary Raffensperger, having more people volunteer as poll workers, getting involved, registering to vote, becoming politically active, and understanding that being part of the process, not giving up, but being part of the process is the way to make sure that the process works. And we're so lucky to have that opportunity in this country.
Great. Thank you. We've got time for one more question, but before we do that, I want to remind everyone that we look forward to seeing you next Tuesday, same place, same time, as we hear the research on how Americans perceive democracy, why it matters, and what we need from our leaders and ordinary citizens in order to protect and perhaps even reform our democracy, both the democratic processes and what a democracy provides for us as citizens. This is a critical piece of our conversations in the last 3 weeks, so I hope to see you all back here next week. What is our last audience question?
Okay, our last question is, many people are afraid to talk or give any respect to the other side because they view them as infringing on their rights or very dangerous. How do you think we can repair intergroup hostility and enable people to learn about one another?
Well, I think one of the things that Larry and I are on different sides of the aisle, but we can sit here tonight and have respectful conversations. On policies, we do disagree on some of the things, but we agree on many others. But I think we agree on the most essential thing, that everyone has the priceless franchise to vote. And we want to make sure we give people the opportunity and the security so that they can exercise that right. And I think that's really important, that we have respectful conversations, that we always understand, that we're talking to another human being. And they come to their viewpoint honestly, just like we do. But listen to each other, see what you can learn. And you sometimes realize that you don't have all the right answers. And maybe as you work together, the scripture talks about that as the Spirit grinds, each of you together. You're kind of working off the rough edges to find something that works. America has always moved forward because we've always had great vision, great aspirations, and we'll continue to do that. But it gets down to each one of us in our communities working together, and it really works tremendously. Because like I said, most people are good, and y'all are wonderful. Never forget that.
I think that's exactly right. It's funny, we were just having this conversation a little bit in the green room earlier, talking about the fact that I was reflecting on the fact that I can remember years ago, I worked at a big law firm. Folks had very different political views. We would talk about them, and there was never any concern that somehow it would escalate into some kind of more deep-seated fight, that we just had different views on things. We learned from each other. We talked about it. And I know many people now who say when they go into a room, politics is verboten. You don't talk politics because you don't know where it might lead. I think it's really important to hear from people who have a different view, to listen respectfully, to try to understand where there's commonality, because there's often commonality, and there may just be a difference in emphasis. There may be a difference in the information that you're getting, and sharing that information is important. So because as Secretary Raffensperger said, you learn. So I think it's just important to talk to people, listen, hear where they're coming from, and try not to let it escalate to a point where you can't talk anymore.
Thank you, gentlemen, and thank you for being with us. I hope to see you back next Tuesday at 6:30. Thank you.